looking to Renato Paglioli's book The Theory of Avant-Garde as a main source. We look at the nuances of fashion, avant-garde, and stereotype. These include topics like fashion in the public, class formations like the Intelligentsia, and the politics that stimulate the movement of avant-garde art.
To start off with a solid base, we should get acquainted with the following definitions according to the Cambridge English Dictionary. Avant-garde, the painters, writers, musicians, and other artists whose ideas, styles, and methods are very original or modern in comparison to the period in which they live, or the work of those artists. Fashion, a style that is popular at a particular time, especially in clothes, hair, makeup, and so on. Stereotype, a set idea that people have about what someone or something is like, especially an idea that is wrong. The beginning of the text follows the narrative that fashion's role is to basically make something trendy, something that wasn't taken as such before, and this process repeats itself on and on. Fashion maintains a continual process of standardization. Once the novelty factor wears off, fashion moves on to the next thing. Now, another important word is poncif, from French, and an approximate translation would be stencil or stereotype. Baudelaire, who coined the term modernity, mentioned that the task of genius is precisely to invent a stereotype. Clement Greenberg, an American essayist and a very influential visual art critic, claimed that both the avant-garde and kitsch were the cultural fruits of the same stage of evolution. So, what does that even mean? What Greenberg basically said is that kitsch and avant-garde are correlative in substance, but authentic in appearance. He, however, studied those movements in too much of a generic way. Kitsch and stereotype must be studied in a specific historical dialectic. Now, on to classical art. More importantly, classical thinking on art. It admits of one single negative category, the ugly. Classicism contemplates the ugly as multiple and relative, in contrast to beauty, which is unique and absolute. The imperfect, exaggerated, monstrous, and so on. What follows is modern art. It expresses the avant-garde as its own supreme moment. While classical art tends towards the ideal of renewing, for modern art, avant-garde in particular, the absolute error is the traditional artistic creation, an art that imitates and repeats itself. So then what is the avant-garde fashion connection? The book states that fashion is a Penelope's web. It means that it is perpetually being done, but never ending. So fashion passes through the cycle mentioned before, making a novelty trendy, abandoning it when it becomes kitsch or cliché, and the cycle goes on and on. Hence Baudelaire's statement that the job of the genius is to create a stereotype. Now let's talk examples. Cubism and Futurism have become the stereotypes of decorative art. Architectural functionalism is becoming the cliché of the building industry. Surrealism began to go under when sensationalism became popular in commercial art. The book mentions that in the sociology of taste, fashion operates as a demiurge, a powerful creative force. The sociology of taste looks at the role of taste in society. It is fair to say that both social and cultural phenomena concerning taste are closely related to the relations and dynamics between people. Therefore, fashion acts as a demiurge in order to justify, modify, and even deny avant-garde art. The conclusion is that the avant-garde should aspire to tradition, constantly evolving, being formed, a tradition modified by each new masterpiece, an anti-traditional tradition.
The word Intelligentsia is a social group that was first founded in revolutionary Russia. It describes the cultural proletariat, or those who labor with their intellect. In the end, it describes a class that is not part of any social class like the bourgeoisie or aristocracy, but is determined to be a part of a group that takes part in forms of cultural life. In fact, the term intelligentsia is a very vague one and is meant to be the avant-garde public. Even more, intelligentsia is never the exact same thing as the intellectual elite, and the avant-garde public can't be described in a social class. To explain this further, let's have a look on the public of classical art. Classical art had almost always the ruling dominant class as a public, therefore also the ruling or dominant class was forming the intellectual elite that takes part and forms the cultural life. The historical parallels help us to understand what happened next. Revolutions, overthrowing of old social structures and elites had as a consequence that there was a vacuum to be filled of whom is going to take part and form culture. Apparently, the new public that formed was formed loose to the concept of a social class. The new public that formed was stretching through different classes and can therefore not really be seen as an actual social class. Most of it was formed by the bourgeoisie, but in more developed countries, even the proletariat was suddenly able to take part in the cultural life.
Nobody is admitting they're an elite. Everyone hates the elite right now, and someone has to stick up for the intellectual elite in this country before we drive this country to the ground.
The intellectual elite furnishes the public for the avant-garde art. What the intellectual elite has in common with the intelligentsia is the circumstance of being formed outside class distinctions. An individual does not enter into a new class, but he simply leaves an old one when he or she elevates himself to the level of the intellectual elite and to the condition of the intelligentsia. The intellectual elite and the intelligentsia both don't have a uniform social base. Both are a species of bohemia. That's why it's often believed that the intelligentsia is the avant-garde public rather than the intellectual elite. The intelligentsia has always been either traditional when it comes to taste or nihilistic when it comes to aesthetic speculations. When the intelligentsia focuses her attention on a work of art or pays homage to it, she almost always functions in terms of ideological attachment. She attaches herself to its content. If we say that the elite is created in a way that is similar to the chemical phenomenon that Goethe used as a psychic metaphor, which was called the elective affinity, the formation of groups that are friendly and hostile to avant-garde art takes place through sympathy and hostility. As said by Ortega y Gasset, it seems to me that the characteristics of new art from a social point of view is to divide the audience into two classes of men, those who understand it and those who do not. The same observation was also made by Leo Tolstoy, with reference to a masterpiece of romantic art. He said that the Ninth Symphony does not unite the whole of humanity, but only a small group, which separates them from the rest. Tolstoy addressed the moral consequences of this separation. Ortega, on the other hand, thinks only of the intellectual causes. What counts is that in both cases we are dealing with the categories of individuals, not social classes. The action and the limits of fashion can be summed up by saying that it has enough power and strength to change the avant-garde spirit, but not enough to make it flourish. In this way we confirm that it does not touch the initial act of faith, and that the elective affinity, which is a condition, is not conditioned. Admirers and followers of avant-garde art can only emerge or cease to exist when they are born with it. And that shows that this circle of admirers and followers does not concede with the intelligentsia.
No such thing as technical problem when a state sends its films outside. China always have very severe censorship. This censorship is so extreme, the West even cannot understand it.
Should we bring up politics now? Because considering how massively political avant-garde art is, I guess we have to, right? I mean, most people think they're making art to urge a political change, but to say that avant-garde is not a product of political climate is pretty ignorant. Coexisting, yes, but predominantly led by political spheres, thoughts, and political opinions. Nonetheless, futurism and fascism live in harmony. Most modern art and artists take on a communist approach to lifestyle and strive for collective progress through their art intentions and their communities. As Poggioli also mentioned, the artist's fight can also be seen as a spiritual warfare. Why? Well, in order to oppose the capitalistic and neo-capitalistic cultures of our time, it must be, right? But like everything else, this means the rise of egocentric, hypocritical, and alienating modern practices. This is what Poggioli refers to as an obscure, anarchistic sentiment, rather than clear Marxist thinking. You know, the poor tortured artist, living in a material world, it's not really that avant-garde, is it? I mean, if they were forced to make art in secret, despite, for example, a Nazi regime, that would bring about something interesting, wouldn't it? So maybe the artist articulates his egotism because some places in the world do not have enough of a direct political polar to oppose, or even enough of a social opportunity to directly boycott their political antagonism. So, all in all, When politics is involved, it gets messy.